Hey everyone, back with another video. So, there's this rabbi here, Rabbi Manis Friedman, and, well, I mean, of course he's obviously Jewish. So I've been watching some of his videos, and he has some interesting points to make, although I believe you have to take some of the things he says with a bit of a grain of salt, because, I mean, after all, he's Jewish, and I don't know if he's supposed to be a mystic or what, because there's this thing about Jewish mysticism, and basically, he goes into some details about, apparently, like, what Jews, actually believe, kind of some interesting things I've been learning. As the Jews, they seem to believe in some interesting things. Like, for one, some of them, not all of them, some of them believe in reincarnation, and there's also this thing called Jewish mysticism, which is this Kabbalah thing right here, which in of itself is kind of strange, and it basically just shows how the whole idea of everything really just goes much deeper than we ever thought. Like, especially in the case of, Christians. I mean, we know what we know, but what's interesting is Jewish people appear to have a whole lot more going on for them than what we see. But what's also interesting is the idea about them believing about reincarnation, which is, in of itself kind of odd. And I don't know, some of the things he says just kind of shed a little bit of light on some of the things that we read in the Bible. Like, for example, doing some research, you find out, so the Sadducees, they don't believe in life after death. The Pharisees do. And then there's some people who believe that the way life after death works is you're just reincarnated. And other people believe that you just, there's this process that you go through, and you basically just go back to heaven. Your soul goes back to heaven. And then another thing, like I said, you have to take with a bit of I would say, a grain of salt, as it doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't line up with what Jesus teaches, in the fact that what this rabbi here says, he says that hell is not a place you go to, but rather an experience you go through. And the idea is that hell is supposed to be like a transition, because your soul is supposed to be godly, and then on your time here on the earth, it does ungodly things. So when it transitions back to being a soul, it apparently is filled with so much regret that it's literally burning with embarrassment, and it has to go through a process, and that process is what's known as hell. And then once you get through that, and you go back to being a soul, and that's heaven. So it's like, I would say, take that with a grain of salt, because that doesn't really go with what Jesus taught, at all. Like I said, I don't agree with everything that this guy says, especially on a few point of views that he said with Christianity. But that's not the point of this video. The point of the video is, so there's something here that in all this stuff here with watching this guy's videos here, I've learned some interesting things, and I've actually learned something and I've figured out what it is that the Jews have missed. So, to understand, the way he puts it is that Judaism is a process of learning about God And the way it happens is you start out effectively with just the basics, and then you build onto it, and you learn more and more over time to reach a level of completion. So, for example, you start with the Ten Commandments, and that's like your basics, and then you're supposed to go on further as the Torah builds up. And as the Torah builds up, you learn more, and then you're supposed to reach this level of perfection, I believe is how he put it. And then what's supposed to happen is the purpose of the Jews is they reach this level of perfection, and then they're supposed to make the world ready for the Messiah to come and establish the era of peace, and then bring God down to earth, is how he puts it. And so the thing about that is, so if the idea that the Jews are supposed to become perfect, we can obviously see where the Jews of the time of Jesus pretty much missed the whole idea. So, as we know when we read the Bible, the Jews at the time of Jesus, they were looking for the Messiah. So, because you had the rabbis, which were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, you had the rabbis, and they followed the law. They pretty much followed the law to the letter, or as they claimed to follow the law to the letter. And so they were looking for the Messiah, because Rome had come, conquered the world, and they believed that they were supposed to be the priests and kings of the world, to do what they were supposed to do to bring God down to the earth. Because, as something else that the rabbi here points out, he says that the purpose of creation of humanity was because God desired a dwelling place in the lowest world. And that the lowest world is supposed to be the mortal realm, the mortal world that we're in now. And so the Jews, their mission is to prepare the world for God, so that he can come down and make his dwelling place. That's essentially what they believe. Now, I want to point out something where the thing that the Jews actually missed is if their whole belief system is that you have to make the world ready for God, you have to achieve this level of perfection. So the Pharisees of the days of Jesus, the rabbis, let's say, the Jewish people, they were looking for the Messiah. As we know, we read, they were looking for the Messiah. So, and they believed at first that Jesus was the Messiah because, they saw him come, and and they did what they did, and everything. But the thing is, they were looking they were missing the point. They were looking for the wrong thing. See, they were looking for a conquering king to come and to establish the kingdom, to make them kings and rulers, and then to establish the era of peace and bring God down to the earth. But there's one small problem with that logic, based on the actual belief system of the Jews here. Their whole idea is that in order for the Messiah to come, in order for them to be able to bring God down to the earth, they first would have to achieve perfection. But here's where they missed it. They believed, the Jews of the day believed that they had achieved that perfection. They were ready for the Messiah. But the truth is, they had not yet reached that final level. That's what they missed. Jesus, you see, first of all, we know as Christians that Jesus was the Messiah. He is the Messiah. And he came. But before he could, and we know that he is going to come again. And when he does come again, he is going to establish the era of peace. But the Jews, they didn't understand. They thought that Jesus was going to come and establish the kingdom. But here's what they missed. And we can actually view it in some areas here. So, first of all, when we have here the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now then, the Jews of the time, they absolutely hated the Samaritans. Now, here's the small problem with that. We know that the law is love. I mean, that's literally what Jesus taught us, to live in love. Yet here we have the Jews who, they hated the Samaritans. And not only did they hate the Samaritans, but they also, the Jews pretty much viewed themselves as superior. You know, like they were superior to the Gentiles. And then even in the case of the Pharisees viewed themselves as superior to other people who were not well educated in the law, like other Jews, right? And then, of course, you also have the division between the Sadducees, the Pharisees, Sadducees, one believing in the afterlife, one not believing in the afterlife. And you have all this division. And, you know, Jesus even tells us that a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. So if the rabbis, the Jews were essentially divided against themselves, how could their kingdom stand? It just doesn't make sense. But like we read here in the parable of Samaritan, so an expert in the law came to test Jesus. He said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And then Jesus said, "What is written in the law?" He replied, "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, with all your mind." Right? And love your neighbor as yourself. This is in Luke 10. And Jesus says, "You have answered correctly." Jesus replied, "Do this and you will live." But then Jesus also, the teacher, he said, but he wanted to justify himself. He asked, "Who is my neighbor?" In other words, what he's saying is, okay, so if I have to love my neighbor as myself, okay, so who is my neighbor? That's then when Jesus goes and then gives the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. All right, so the guy, he's a Jew, all right, a Jewish man, going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Okay, so the guy's obviously sitting there, injured and bleeding. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on by the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of the 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go do likewise. So, right here, this is a big deal, because Jesus is literally telling you that, hey, the Samaritans, the people you hate, are your neighbors. Love them. Love your neighbors. Love your enemies. And that's the thing, the Jews, the rabbis, they thought that they were so perfect, and yet they had the actual hatred toward the Samaritans. They viewed themselves as better than the Gentiles. They viewed themselves as superior. To the Jews of those days, Gentiles were nothing more than slaves, pretty much. And that's not at all what the ways of God. You see, as the rabbi here, he points out, he actually says that when he actually mentions again that the purpose of humanity is both Jews and Gentiles working together to bring God down to the earth. So, but how does that work then with the Jews of the days of Jesus? You see, another thing that the rabbi also mentions here is that a Jew must always look upon someone else as superior to them. That right there is the very definition of humility, which is, as we know, as again the Bible teaches us, we must humble ourselves before the Lord. God resists the proud. And the Pharisees essentially, you see, they had pride in their hearts. See, they viewed themselves as better than others, In the case here with the Good Samaritan, you see, I believe that when the priest and the Levites saw the man and they passed by, it wasn't that they didn't want to help the man. See, a lot of people view it as they just didn't want to help the man. However, I don't think that's the case. I actually think, when you look at it, that what it was is that the priest and the Levite, you see, they had to follow the law exactly. And as part of the law is that if you were to touch blood, that would actually make you unclean. And being a priest and a Levite, I mean, obviously here, they couldn't allow themselves to become unclean according to the law and their traditions. So it's not so much that they maybe didn't want to help the man, it's that their own law and traditions forbid them to help the man, pretty much. So what Jesus is actually also pointing out here is he's saying that, hey, this law, it's not the completed story. As we know, Jesus, he came to fulfill the law, right? He didn't come to abolish it, but he came to fulfill it. See, and then also later, as we know from the Apostle Paul, he tells us that the law was a schoolmaster, which goes right along with the Jewish belief system, as the law teaches you the ways of God, teaches you about God. And it gets you from one level to the next. So you start with the Ten Commandments, then you have the extra laws that get on, and then you have the rabbinical stuff, and you keep on going. You learn more and more and more, okay? Now, but the point is, you have to understand, the law was not the final thing. It was not the salvation. The law was a teacher to teach the ways. All right, to prepare them to get the Jewish people to a certain level, as the rabbi, as the rabbi here says, all right, in some of his videos, all right. Now then, but the thing that they missed is, see, they got to this point where they effectively believed that they knew it all, that they were ready. But the thing is, pride caused them to believe that, when the truth is that they believed they had perfection. They studied the scriptures diligently, believing in them they have eternal life. But they missed the point, because they're following this law, they're doing what they're doing, but yet actually in a way they're not following the law. As we know, Jesus, he referred to them as hypocrites. The Pharisees. He called the Pharisees, instead Sadducees, hypocrites. Now, why would he say that? Because they're doing all this to follow the law, and they're teaching the people to do this, but yet the thing is that they're doing all this, but yet they're allowing pride in their hearts. And pride is not the law. The law pretty much literally teaches you to get rid of pride. But yet they had pride in their hearts. So the reason Jesus called them hypocrites is because, I mean, sure, they may have been doing the law, sure, they may have been following the letter, but the truth is, to take on the law, to do the law means you have to do the whole law. And to break even one small aspect of the law means you've broken the whole law. Therefore, if the Pharisees had pride in their hearts, they were therefore breaking a part of the law. And because they were breaking a part of the law, one part of the law, they are therefore breaking the whole law. And they are therefore nothing more than a bunch of hypocrites, because they say they're doing the law, but they're actually not. And this can also be seen here, right, in the fact that the Jews hated the Samaritans, but yet, as Jesus points out, hey, the Samaritans are your neighbors. They're your brothers. Okay? They're your brothers. They're your sisters. They're your neighbors. And as we know, like when Jesus was talking about on the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Or, and other scripts, judge, basically angry without a cause, But still, that's the point. The Jews, with the way they treated the Samaritans, and that's completely against the true nature of God, the true requirements of God. I mean, they may have understood the ways of God and aspects of God from the law, but they really didn't understand the true requirements of God, which Jesus came to teach. And that was literally the whole point. The Jews had reached a level to where the Messiah could come, but because of pride, they missed the whole point. That before the time could officially come that the Jews were looking for, they first had to be taught another level. They first had to be brought up to the next level, thereby achieving their completion, and the kingdom could then come. And again here, as we can see in Luke 6, it said, love your enemy, love for your enemies. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. This whole passage right here. See, this is the true nature of God, the true requirements of God that they were missing. You see, because the Jews, you know, they they straight up had hatred for their enemies, and they believed that they were superior, and they definitely would not do this stuff. Like right here, it wasn't what they were taught. It wasn't what they were brought up to believe. But the truth is, this is what Jesus was trying to teach them: is that, hey, this is what if you're looking for completion, is what Jesus was kind of teaching them is that they were looking for completion, which is also pretty much, again, everything that this rabbi here is saying. The whole point of the Jews is to achieve completion, to bring about the Messiah. But again, the Jews of those days had missed the point. The Messiah could not come because they had not yet achieved, as I say, the kingdom that they were looking for could not come because they had not yet achieved their level of completion that they were looking for. They thought they had, but that was because of pride. See, pride causes all kinds of problems, all right? God resists the proud, okay? Pride can make you think that you've achieved a level of perfection even when you haven't. And so, yeah, your righteousness is essentially nothing but filthy rags. I mean, that's literally what the Bible tells us. So, this pretty much here is literally, what they were missing. Jesus had to come and teach them, pretty much. So another thing to also point out, as another thing that the Jews also missed, is, so this actually has to deal with sin. And so here's the deal. God created humanity. God loves humanity. Again, the rabbi agrees with that. Okay, and I agree with that, because that's literally what the Bible tells us. God created humanity. God He created us for a purpose. Okay, we may not know exactly what that true purpose was, but we know we were created for a purpose, and He created all humanity. He loves all humanity, and as the rabbi here also points out, if Jews and Gentiles are supposed to work together, then obviously the Jews are not superior to the Gentiles. Gentiles are not superior to the Jews. We're all brothers and sisters. So, there's a purpose. The reason why Jesus had to come is not only did He, one, have to teach us how to reach that next level in order to achieve completion and perfection, but He also had to come to reconcile all humanity to God and to put sin to death. Now, one of the things I learned while watching Him, which kind of makes sense actually, is, so He says that sin has to die. Now, he says it as that humans do not have to die, but the sin has to die. Of course, as we know, it is because of sin that we die. Now, why is that? Well, as he puts it here, the person doesn't have to die, but the sin has to die. Now, if you take that into account with how the Jews would do their sacrifices, the Jews of those days did the sacrifices, it actually makes sense. The person would sin, and the person would therefore become sin. So because the person now became sin, that person would have to die. But because God did not want the people to die, what does He do? He establishes the sacrifices. So the Jews, they would take an animal and they would sacrifice the animal. And during the sacrificial process, the sin was essentially transferred from the person to the animal. the animal would become the sin and then die, thereby killing the sin. The sin would die. That makes sense, because otherwise, I mean, why else did they do it? You know, but it makes it in a way. It kind of makes sense. If the animal would become the sin in place of the human, the sin then would die by the animal dying. So, if we go then back to the idea of Jesus, see, there's this part here in the Bible where it's right here in 2 Corinthians. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we may become the righteousness of God. So what this is saying here is that Jesus was made sin. See, I never actually fully understood that until now. See, we know that when Jesus was crucified, the entire sin of the world was put upon him and died with him. But I never quite understood the idea that so Jesus, I mean, I know that the sin was placed on him, but the fact that he was made sin, I don't think I ever quite understood that, but now I do. The idea is that when we sin, we become sin. And if sin has to die, we would therefore have to die because we are sin. So the sin would then be transferred to the animal. The animal would then become the sin and die. Makes sense. So, here's the problem with that. First of all, the thing that the Jews of those days missed was the fact that God wants all humanity to be reconciled to him, not just the Jews. So that means, Samaritans, Gentiles, everything, all of them. Here's the other thing. If sin has to die, and in order for sin to die, you have to take the sin and put it on something else and then have that thing die. So that way the person does not have to die. I mean, okay, so there were obviously a lot less people back then. Today, we have billions of people on the earth. Now, as we know, we have all sinned. If sin has to die, and we have to take the sin and place it on an animal for it to die, there would be no animals left. Every single animal in the entire earth would be extinct by now. I mean, just saying. So, obviously that's a problem. So, God, he has to create a solution to that problem. In order for sin to die, how do you kill sin once and for all, so that the animals essentially don't go extinct, and that humanity can be redeemed? Because, if all the animals went extinct, then there would be no more animals to atone for sin. And what do you do then, right? You sin, you sacrifice the animal, you're clean of the sin. But then you sin again. What do you do? There's no more animals. What do you do? So, God, he made a way. He himself came to the earth to become sin and die, thereby once and for all putting an end to sin. You see where I'm going here? God, before he could establish the final plan, which is to make his dwelling place here on the earth, which he will do, that's recorded in Revelation, he will do that. But before he could do that, he first had to come and bring humanity to that final level and put sin to death. See, a way you could look at it is if the Jews, if the purpose of the Jews were to make the world ready for God, if that is in fact true, okay, if that wasn't in fact true, that would mean that sin dwells in the mortal realm. So, in order to prepare the mortal realm for God, you have to eliminate sin. So, what happened? God used the Jewish people to effectively do that by creating a bloodline that he himself could then be born into the world and do that very thing, put an end to sin and bring about a generation of priests and kings to go about and reconcile humanity back to God. And that pretty much right there is everything that the Jews missed. They believed that they were supposed to be kings and priests. They were looking for a Messiah to come and establish the kingdom. They were, in their own minds, ready. But the truth is, they were not yet there at that highest level. They thought they were, but the truth is they weren't. They missed the fact that, while yes, the Messiah that they were looking for is going to come when Jesus returns, but before that could come, God first had to teach them the final level and to reconcile humanity back to himself and put sin to death once and for all. But they missed that. You see, they were looking at their ways. They were looking at what they believed, what they thought. But the truth is that the ways of God are so much higher than the ways of man. As in Isaiah, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." See, the Jews, they spend all this time trying to learn the ways of God, and yet they missed the whole point. They thought that they had learned the ways of God. They thought that they had it all together. But they didn't. No, they didn't. That's the whole point. That's what they missed. They literally missed the whole point. Is that God, they thought they knew what God was doing, but they didn't. God had a plan. He was using them, but yet his plan was not quite the same as what they thought. And that's what they missed. So, to understand, basically, the best thing that can happen to a Jew is for them to actually learn about Jesus. Because Jesus, the very teachings of Jesus, is that final level that they're looking for. I mean, the Jews, they may have a lot of knowledge, and they may, I would say that Jewish people probably, in some cases, know a lot more about God than Christians. But the thing is, there's that final level, though, that they have not achieved. So, if you're a Christian and you want to do something for the Jews, the best thing you can do is don't put yourself back under a law which was only meant to teach you. Instead, teach the Jews about Jesus and help them to reach that final level that they are looking for. That's because that's the whole point. That's the whole point of all of this. And that's what the Jews missed.